Of all weekends, of all days, of all events that we can celebrate, the Easter story, Jesus' death and resurrection, there is nothing as important to Christians as those events. And if those events really did happen, as I believe they did and many of us do, and as we're going to explore a little bit this afternoon, if those things really did happen, then not only is this weekend that we celebrate the most important and significant of all events for the church, but it is quite simply the most important celebration, the most important event that has ever happened in the history of the world. And it is also the most important event to every single man, woman, and child, regardless of what we think, what we believe, or anything else. There is nothing more important or pressing than the resurrection of Jesus, if indeed he really did come back to life. And as we start, this isn't my main point, but just let me make clear that Jesus is unique. And let us not, any one of us, imagine for a moment that Jesus really was just another man, a great man even. Jesus is completely unique to every single religion that I know of. In other words, no one else features in all the religions of the world except that one person, Jesus. He was a Jew. To Islam, to Muslims, Jesus is the most significant, important of all the prophets that ever lived. That's what the Quran, that's what Muhammad taught. But to all the Eastern mystic religions like Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and all the others, if you used to speak to those followers, they would all tell you Jesus indeed was an incarnation of God himself. Nobody else can make that claim. No one. I'm going to quote a couple of people throughout the message, not because they're authorities, but because they just put what they say so well, better than I could. And regarding the impact of Jesus, century pastor, this is what he writes, and think carefully about these truths. Speaking of Jesus, he writes, he was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30 years old. Then, for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He didn't live in a big city. He never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 years old, and the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends deserted him. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone. And today, he is the central within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary figure. That's an amazing truth, isn't it? He had no internet, he had no position, he had no phone, nothing like that, and yet he's divided and become the central point of all history. He is unique in his impact. He's unique in that we can't easily categorize this person. I mean, I realise that most people, they never really think about Jesus. But when you stop and think about him, you begin to realise that he is like no other person. And when our minds, what they try and do is find, where does he fit? What kind of person was he? And what we find is he doesn't fit any of our normal categories. For example, we might want to say that he was a good religious leader, right? That's a kind of an obvious one that often people say. But Jesus, as C.S. Lewis put it, went around forgiving sins. Jesus went around forgiving sins. Well, we can all forgive people's sins, can't we? Again, as C.S. Lewis said, if someone treads on your toe, well, you can choose to forgive that person. That's fine. But that's not what we're talking about with Jesus. It's more like this. Someone treads on your toe and Jesus forgives them. Imagine a court scene where a person is on trial for murder and the proceedings are going ahead. So everyone would look at them and think, who on earth do you think you are? You can't just forgive people. But that's what Jesus did. If he was just a man and a great religious leader, but still just a man, he wouldn't go around forgiving people's sins like that. He would have no authority and no right to do that. Here's another thing that makes him hard to categorize. If Jesus was just a man, if you put him in that category and a religious leader, well, he accepted people's worship. Thomas, the apostle, fell at Jesus' feet and said, "My Lord and my God." If Jesus was a good religious leader, like you get lots of good religious leaders, then Jesus would have said, "Thomas, I'm just a man, get up." But he didn't. That's not what he said. Jesus said, "You believe who have not seen." A good man, a good religious leader does not accept worship from people, but Jesus did. Well, then maybe he was a charlatan. That's generally the case, isn't it? If someone is taking worship from people, they've deceived them. They're a liar and a charlatan. Maybe Jesus was demented, a lunatic, thinking that he actually was this great person, this God. But when you read the pages of the Gospels, and I want to recommend that everyone do that. If you've not read the Gospels lately, then get a Gospel and read through it, okay? This is what Albert Einstein said. And remember, I'm not quoting these people as authorities, but just they put it so well. Albert Einstein, when asked about the extent of the influence of Christianity upon him, this is what he said. "As a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene." Albert Einstein, that great man, when he read the Gospels, he was enthralled by Jesus. Hardly a lunatic, hardly a charlatan. And when he was asked about whether he accepted the historical reality of the existence of Jesus, he answered this: "Unquestionably. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates with every word. No myth is filled with such life. And this is why I want to say to you, read the Gospels if you've not read them, or if you haven't read them for a long time, or if you've only sort of looked at them in Sunday school or whatever. Actually just get with the Gospels and read them, and let that luminous figure, that Nazarene, Jesus, let him press in upon your consciousness. Let him speak to you through the pages of Scripture. The idea that maybe he was just a liar, there is a problem with that. And the problem is this: Jesus was crucified precisely because of who he claimed to be. When he was on trial, the Bible tells us he was silent until he was asked this question. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And this was Jesus' reply. And again, think, is this a charlatan? Is this a liar? Is this a lunatic? Is this a good man? Jesus said this, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his robes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy." And right there, we come to the crux of the matter. If Jesus was not who he claimed to be, then he was a blasphemer. And it was right for him to be crucified as such. The last quote is from C.S. Lewis, because he sums all that up really quite well. Speaking along similar lines, this is what he writes. He says, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, which is, people say, 'I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God.' That is the one thing," C.S. Lewis says, "you must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." All of that is to say, Jesus is unique. He's not really comparable to anyone else. Mahatma Gandhi, speaking of Jesus, and he was a great man, Mahatma Gandhi, he said that no greater teaching has fallen from the lips of any other man. Jesus is unique. And for 2,000 years, his resurrection has been celebrated. We're celebrating it now. Reminding ourselves what Easter is actually about, the resurrection of the Son of God. But I know that to many of us, to many people out there, maybe to some of you online, Easter has become really quite empty. The highlight is eating chocolate. And we all like eating chocolate, don't we? We love it, okay? It's a good thing. I like chocolate. But when we reduce Easter to just eating chocolate and a couple of weeks or a couple of days, whatever you got off of work, we really are missing the glory of it all. We're going to spend the remainder of our time thinking about those words that we had read of the Apostle Apostle Paul. Paul was basically saying this, that many people believe there's no afterlife, nothing after this life, that once we're gone, we're gone, and that Jesus wasn't actually raised from the grave. Now, here's the thing, right? If you study theology, if you study the Bible, and I mean like as scholars study it, and you read all the scholarship on the Bible and on particularly on the person Jesus, what you find is right across the board, right, there's agreement. Okay, so when I say there's agreement, I mean between believers who are scholars and those who are not believers. They all agree on certain things, and this is what they agree on. They agree that Jesus lived. That's not controversial. It's not controversial for an obvious reason. Lots of people called Jesus lived at that time. Okay, there's nothing controversial about that. They agree that he lived a radical life. He caused a stir. There's no question about that. They agree that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. And again, there's nothing particularly controversial about someone being crucified under Pontius Pilate. In fact, when during Jesus' trial, we was thinking about this on Sunday, he was being tried alongside another man called Barabbas. Jesus Barabbas was his name. Two people called Jesus who were on trial. And had Barabbas been found, or not been redeemed, as it were, he would have been crucified. Two Jesuses that day would have been crucified. There's nothing controversial about Jesus dying on the cross. Scholars don't have any problem with that. There's historical evidence, plenty of it. And we'll look at one little bit of it a little bit later. So there's nothing controversial about Jesus dying on the cross. In fact, anyone that got crucified died. It's just what happens. When you think about it, everyone dies, don't they? Nothing controversial about that. The controversial bit in the story of Jesus is the resurrection. And it's the resurrection that people want to whitewash out of the Christian story. But it's the resurrection that is the most significant aspect of the Easter story. Because Jesus predicted, in fact, the whole Bible predicts this, but Jesus predicted himself that he would be crucified. And that after 3 days, he would be raised again to eternal life. And in those predictions, they were to validate his claims to deity and his authority and his kingdom. In other words, he's preached about the kingdom of God and that he is this coming king. And he was saying, here's how you're going to know that everything that I'm saying is true. I'll be crucified and I'll be raised again to life. The resurrection of Jesus is absolutely crucial. The Apostle Paul makes that absolutely clear. This is what he says. I'll just read it for us again. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. That's quite a statement, isn't it? If Christ has not been raised, Christianity is a whole pile of rubbish. Absolutely meaningless. Well, here's something that people often say to me. Maybe you've thought this yourself when you've met Christians. And maybe if you're a Christian here, you've had people say this to you. People have often said to me, or occasionally at least, I wish I could have faith like you. Has anyone ever said that to you? Yeah, I admire your faith, people say sometimes. I wish I could have faith. As if faith is something that we just have and some people just don't have it. But I want to say this, okay, as we think about the resurrection. Faith is about confidence, isn't it? So I've got confidence that my motorbike, the next time I ride it, is not going to go wrong. If I didn't have confidence, do you know what? I wouldn't get on it and ride it. But I'm confident it's going to be safe, reasonably safe. In other words, I have a degree of faith, right? And isn't that true for every single one of us? We all have faith. So when people say, Julian, I wish I could have faith like you, or I admire that you have faith, well, maybe Maybe the problem is that you've just not looked into the claims of Jesus and the evidence for his resurrection. And that seems to be what the case with most people. They've never really thought about it, or they thought it's just something you either believe or not. But I want to encourage you to look into the evidence for the resurrection and to read the Gospels. We're going to spend our last few moments thinking about the implications of the evidence, okay? So here's how we're going to do it, very simply. I'm going to read one paragraph. This is a very significant paragraph written by a man called Tacitus, who was a Roman historian who lived and wrote just after the burning of Rome. Okay, Nero had Rome burned down so that he could build a new palace, and he blamed Christians. And Tacitus was not a Christian. In fact, you can tell from what he writes that he hated Christians. But listen to what he says. Nero wrote to what Tacitus writes, and we're going to unpick this a little bit. Nero, he writes, fastened the guilt, that's for the burning of Rome, on a class hated for their abominations called Christians. So Nero basically blamed Christians for the burning of Rome. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name has its religion, Christus, that's Christ, suffered the extreme penalty. Now, everyone then would have known that that meant crucifixion. Suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And the most mischievous superstition, so that's how he sees Christianity, as a mischievous superstition, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Now, just in that one paragraph, written by a kind of what you might call an ancient times journalist, we know that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that he died on the cross, but a short time later, his disciples were claiming and proclaiming that he was risen. That we can get just from that paragraph. And that means that when we think about the resurrection of Jesus, we have to consider a few basic facts, or primarily two basic facts. One, an empty tomb. We'll come to that in a moment. And two, why it is that those first Christians proclaimed that Jesus was risen. So these are significant, and here's the reason why. If Jesus wasn't raised, if he didn't come back to life, and the disciples, we know they did this, claimed and proclaimed that Jesus was risen, all the Roman authorities needed to do, all the Jews, is go to the tomb and drag out Jesus' corpse and show everyone he's not risen. That was it. That would have ended Christianity there and then. But when the disciples went around claiming and proclaiming that Jesus was risen, they couldn't. The tomb was empty. Some people say that, well, the disciples stole the body. It wasn't the disciples stole the body, so when the Romans or the Jews went there, there was no body to be found. The only problem with that is the disciples who proclaimed that Jesus was alive all suffered. In fact, 11 of the 12 were martyred. And people don't die for a lie. People just don't do that. Others say this, that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, he fainted. And then he came to in the cool of the tomb. But that's highly unlikely. If Jesus survived crucifixion, which he wouldn't have, But if he did, he would have died in the tomb. The Romans, or crucifixion, was a form of torture that had been developed over a period of 300 years and perfected by the Romans. And Romans knew that if they didn't kill their victim, they would pay the price. Jesus was dead on the cross. The scriptures tell us that he was pierced, that the soldiers, they didn't break his legs, they rammed a spear up under his ribs, and that there was a flow of blood and water. That only happens after death. Well, here's another theory. The disciples really did believe that Jesus was raised, but they were hallucinating. The swoon theory, the hallucination theory, and the stolen body theory, that the disciples lied or the Romans stole the body, they're the only real options open to us, other than the Christian explanation, that Jesus is indeed who he claimed to be. And so, as we close, I want to encourage you all, every one of us, to maybe do what I've said already. Get a Bible, get your face in a Bible and read one of the Gospels and just let the person of Jesus come to life before your eyes. That's one thing that I want to encourage us to do. If you've not done it, do it. See for yourself. But then the second thing that I want to encourage you to do, if you don't have faith, then it's probably because you don't have confidence in the reality of the resurrection. And that's probably because you've not actually spent the time to look into it. I've just given you very briefly those theories, the swoon theory, the hallucination theory, the stolen body theory. All theories boil down to those three. So it's not actually hard. If you can think of another explanation, let me know. Look at the evidence. Weigh it up. And then make your decision. Is Jesus a liar or a lunatic? Or, as C.S. Lewis put it, Lord?